I do not see his likeness elsewhere. His name will live in English letters. It will live in the annals of war. It will live in the legends of Arabia. Those were the final words of the first speech I ever gave in my life. I was 12 years old, and I don't know how I remember those words 44 years later. I don't remember the rest of the speech. But they are the words that Winston Churchill spoke at the funeral of T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. And the events that took place in the Middle East exactly 100 years ago, in which Churchill and Lawrence were important players, have directly led to the world that we have today in the Middle East, with the wars, the refugee problem, and the terrorism. 100 years ago, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, had been ruling over the Arabs for about 500 years. But as World War I approached, with the Ottoman Empire dying, the vultures were moving in for the kill, the British and French empires. This area at that time was known as the Great Loot because of the oil. Here in the Muslim holy city of Mecca, there was a tribal chieftain by the name of King Hussein, who was a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Hussein was a relatively decent leader, very moderate in terms of Islam. He had a vision of the Arabs revolting against the Ottoman Empire and reuniting into one strong country that could hold its own against the Western imperial plunderers. And the British and French needed the Arabs in order to defeat the Ottoman Empire. T.E. Lawrence was an Oxford-trained archaeologist who traveled extensively in the Middle East on archaeological digs, fell in love with the Arab people. As World War I approached, T.E. became the emissary from the British Empire to King Hussein. And he also, even though he had no military training, he managed to help the Arabs in the guerrilla warfare that they were going to fight against the Turks. More about Lawrence later. But as World War I came to an end, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. The British and French double-crossed the Arabs and carved up the Great Loot for themselves. And they threw King Hussein a little bone because he helped them. Classic imperialism. You carve up a larger country into smaller chunks, you install puppet rulers who you control, and you incite rivalries so the people can never unite and drive you out. The French, 100 years ago, took over Syria and Lebanon. Today, 100 years later, Syria has descended into civil war and is a failed state, with the modern empires, the Russian Empire, and the American Empire from the other side of the planet, arming one side and the other in Syria's civil war. The British Empire, 100 years ago, took over Iraq and Palestine, and they installed King Hussein's son as a puppet ruler who they controlled, as a puppet king. About 35 years later, the successor to that king tried to establish his independence from the West. By that time, the British Empire was finished, and the American Empire was guarding the Great Loot. The Americans didn't like the idea of an independent Arab ruler, so the CIA overthrew that ruler and installed a more pro-American dictator by the name of Saddam Hussein. Roughly 25 years after that, when Saddam Hussein got too big for his britches and stopped taking his marching orders from the Americans, the United States went to war with him, starting with the first Gulf War in 1991, and the Americans have been at war in Iraq ever since for the last 26 years. And of course, Iraq is now a failed state, descended into civil war. The bone that was thrown to King Hussein was the Arabian Peninsula itself, because it's all desert, and 100 years ago the British didn't think there was all that much oil there. Ha 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 ha! But King Hussein, unfortunately for him and for us, was overthrown by another tribal leader who was based in the holy city of Medina. This other tribal leader's name was Ibn Saud. Today the country is named after him. It is called Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia. Today, Ibn Saud's family still rules the country, and they practice the most extreme form of Islam called Wahhabism. Amazingly enough, Saudi Arabia is America's closest ally in the Middle East. Even though they lead the world in beheadings, women have almost no rights, they support jihadi groups like ISIS, and almost all of the 9/11 hijackers who blew up the World Trade Centers were Saudi Arabian Wahhabists, including Osama bin Laden himself, whose family has very close ties to Ibn Saud's family. And also, the Saudi Arabians are currently waging a genocidal war against the impoverished country of Yemen. This is where Trump had his botched Navy SEAL raid last month, in which 10 innocent children were killed, in addition to 1 Navy SEAL. For some reason, Trump only talked about the Navy SEAL and forgot to mention the 10 innocent children. Go figure. The family of King Hussein, for all their trouble, only ended up with the small country of Jordan, which has no oil, and the current king of Jordan, King Abdullah, is the great-great-grandson of King Hussein. That brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, Israel-Palestine. This elephant-in-the-room puzzle speech for Iran is another speech. But 100 years ago, Palestine was part of the British Empire's share of the Great Loot. Right near the end of World War I, the British made their famous Balfour Declaration, in which they declared that the British Empire looks with favor upon the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, in spite of the fact, at that time, 90% of the population of Palestine were Arabs, and only 10% were Jews. But declaring something is one thing, but enforcing it is another. At that time, Winston Churchill was the colonial secretary of the British Empire, and it was his job to make important decisions for the Middle East. Right after the end of World War I, Churchill went on a grand tour of the Middle East and took with him T.E. Lawrence as his top advisor. Eventually their entourage ended up in Gaza City, right here, which has been the site of horrendous warfare between the Israelis and the Arabs in recent years. But when Churchill arrived in Gaza City 100 years ago, there had as yet been no or almost no violence between the Jews and the Arabs. And Jews had lived all throughout the Middle East for thousands of years, and they were treated relatively decently by the Turks, by the Arabs, by the Iranians, certainly a lot better than they were treated by the Europeans. But when Churchill arrived in Gaza City, there were 150,000 people in the streets making a lot of noise. Churchill didn't speak Arabic, but he got really excited. He turned to Lawrence and said, "T.E., are they cheering for me because the British Empire has finally freed them from the Ottoman Empire?" Lawrence, who did speak Arabic, replied, "No, I'm sorry, Winston. What they're actually doing, screaming, is death to the Jews." Churchill replied, "Well, these Jews and Arabs have lived together peacefully for thousands of years. They'll work it out." Lawrence replied, "I don't think so, Winston. These Arabs are a fierce people. They will never accept the Balfour Declaration. Never." Churchill disregarded what Lawrence said and chose to enforce the Balfour Declaration, effectively allowing unlimited immigration of Jews from Europe into Palestine. The rest, as they say, is history.